Rise up, comrades! Rise up! For today, not only shall we throw off our chains, those chains of our oppressors, but today, we're talking about world-building class structures in your fictional society. But class is a nebulous term, isn't it? What does it really mean? Sociologist Max Weber said that what we're really talking about here is the relationship between three things: wealth, power, and status, what he called the three-component theory of stratification. Now, these three things do correlate and do cause one another. People with power tend to have status, and people with wealth tend to have power. But just because class structures aren't great doesn't mean that they can have no logic to them. Divergent. Damn it, I promised myself I'd resist. Point being, having an upper class in an Earth-like society with all the wealth, but none of the power, and none of the status, is probably unrealistic world building. So when thinking about creating your fictional class structure, figuring out how wealth, power, and status relate is a great foundation. I am so excited because today we're going to be discussing all of these fascinating things. Timestamps are to the side, and of course, thank you to patrons who make this sort of educational content, which is a little bit more niche, possible, and sustainable. Thank you so much. If you want to join the Discord, which is full of writers and word builders, links are down below. Hope to see you there. Let's just jump into it. Part 1. Wealth, power, and status. In other words, whatever YouTubers don't have in society usually. Though they do tend to correlate, this doesn't mean that these three things always come together. Old noble classes these days in the UK or Japan may have status and wealth, but not a huge amount of power anymore, at least relative to what they used to have. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby explores how though Gatsby acquires immense material wealth, he is never quite able to attain the same status as those born into money because that comes from your lineage. In William Nicholson's The Windsinger, power comes from academic achievement in their rigorously meritocratic society, but being a member of the upper class does not guarantee wealth, just an intellectual job. This is because status, wealth, and power do not necessarily come from the same place. What does your society culturally value, defining status, materially value, defining wealth, and how do people exert political power? Answering these questions will characterize your characters from each class, what they wear, eat, their mannerisms, their job. It'll tell you what types of people are in each class, and we'll get more into this in our part on class culture. Historically, class structure has been predominantly organized by wealth or the job you have. Interestingly enough, this could be intensified in fantasy or alien societies like the Protoss in StarCraft, where some individuals are born for a certain job in a way that humans just aren't. Edward says here that you would like to be a masseuse. Yeah, not sure about that. You might be best to stick to that hairdresser class, yeah? Yeah? Just saying, this isn't a mark against you, but your class isn't really made for it with, the whole snip snip. But your society could be different. It could be predominantly organized by status or by power instead. Ian M. Banks's The Culture series is based in a post-scarcity world where the economy is fully automated. Class is thus defined by status, how much people like you. While you normally expect farmers to be the lowest class in any sort of system, during the Japanese Edo period they actually held a higher status than merchants, who were wealthier. This was because of a Neo-Confucianist philosophy that valued essential services like producing food over non-essential services. No idea why I'm pausing on this. No idea how it could be possibly relevant to our current geopolitical and sociological circumstances. That certainly didn't mean that peasants had more power and wealth than merchants who could travel freely. But the more important point here is that when designing a class structure, a single stratification pyramid rarely fully encompasses the complexities of wealth, power, and status. The economy, culture, and politics of society are constantly changing, and because of that, they're always a little out of sync with one another. It takes time for them to influence one another. Consider how your economy, politics, or culture changing may mean that a class has less of one of these things than a supposedly lower class. Part 2. Social mobility. The American dream! Yes, that's right. If you work hard, even you can die in a nicer coffin than a poor person. Social mobility is how you acquire or lose wealth, status, or power, both together or separately, to move through the classes. The Song dynasty is a rare example in history of relative ease with which people could ascend the classes, through an imperial exam. As Painty Ho writes, the second basic concept of Confucian philosophy is that the feudal order could not be salvaged unless it was based on the principle that the wise, able, and virtuous should rule. The competitive civil service examination system became a permanent channel for the recruitment of members of the ruling class. Though rare for middle or lower class people to ever get the opportunity in the first place, it still happened occasionally. It was a lot easier for people to acquire status and power through academic excellence, though wealth was still very difficult to acquire. What we're seeing is what I described, discrepancies in the classes of wealth, power, and status because society was changing and evolving, and they were being distributed differently to how they were before. Maybe instead of academic excellence in your fictional society, you might value great military feats, or maybe they've been long under a quarantine because of a worldwide plague, so they value bakers, like we do now, and will forever in the future. In a fantastical society, it's incredibly common for magic to grant one social mobility. The Last Airbender indicates that firebending allows even peasants to acquire power and status as they fulfill more specialized jobs, especially if they support the war effort in this very militarized society. See, the people don't get it. The Fire Nation was clearly progressive. Hashtag women can be war criminals too. If you are wanting to have a peasant be allowed to speak to lords and kings, which never happened, mind you, then magic is one way that writers do this. But economically, perhaps the most important factor is education. How much they get, and if different classes get different educations. Dorling writes in Class Segregation of how incredibly important this is. Class differences in the UK are almost 100 times higher than race differences, as 24 times is 2,500%. The class segregation involved in access to higher education is huge. The technology of the Industrial Revolution may have created economic opportunity for a rising middle class by freeing up their time and allowing them to upskill, but it was the new education system that really underpinned that. Widespread education worked against the class divide by increasing literacy and numeracy rates and diversifying their job opportunities from, oh hey, don't care. Yeah, we've got some job openings. You can go in factory number 1, no? Factory number 2, no? Oh, just for you, we've got a refining, yeah? Factory. Your pick. Suddenly, lower, middle, and upper class children were learning some similar skills, even if lords and ladies were also learning to play horse polo and feint on demand. Educational opportunity, especially at primary and high school levels, closes the economic gap in a class system by making it easier to acquire wealth, status, and power. So, what skills are members of each class usually being taught, and how do these relate to acquiring those three things? But it's equally important to figure out which choices or attributes make social mobility harder. Historically, the most obvious ones are your sex, race, religion, those sort of things. The Umayyad Empire required religious conversion if you were to acquire power in their society, and they levied taxes on those that didn't convert, making it harder to acquire wealth and run successful businesses. Ideas of racial hierarchy during the colonial period made it harder for some indigenous groups to attain status. Andrzej Sapkowski's Witcher series is an interesting example of magic actually making you less socially mobile. It lowers your status as people see you as this monstrous other, a cruel outsider. So, consider which things in your world, both choices your characters make and their inherent attributes, make acquiring status, power, and wealth easier, especially education, and which things make acquiring them harder. But you see, the concept of social mobility is complicated by a certain type of class system. Let's talk about that. Part 3. Caste Systems. These are slightly different to class systems in that while certain castes will still usually have more or less power, status, and wealth, which caste you are in is usually overtly determined by things you cannot control. Where you were born, such as the Japanese Burakuman, or your family in the Indian caste system, which influences the jobs you can usually have. In Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight archives, society is divided into people with light eyes and dark eyes. This means social mobility is incredibly difficult. You can change your eye color only through acquiring a magical item called shard plate, which is nearly impossible. Caste systems also sometimes have a class of moral untouchables, people who are entirely socially immobile, who are morally degenerate or to be cast out. They aren't suited, like we should have for people who prefer dogs to cats. It's for this reason that caste systems are often used in dystopian or grimdark stories like Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World, which divides people into alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons along the lines of genetic superiority. It's an easy way to signal to the reader what's wrong with the world, why is it terrible, and it sets up narrative goals for an underdog character, who is usually the protagonist. However, fictional species provide a unique opportunity for caste system societies. They may work differently to humans, with biological factors or abilities that really do segregate society more rigidly without needing to be oppressive. You can see this a lot in ant-like species with a queen, warrior, and worker class structure, like in Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. In Nier Automata by Yoko Taro, android society is divided by function. You are either created as a scanner, a fighter, an operator, or a commander. This is a caste system of sorts, not one we typically recognize, but it's not necessarily oppressive. It's more of a horizontal class system instead of a vertical pyramid of sorts. But I want to point out that class systems and caste systems may not be as separate as you might think. In a sense, there was a caste system explored in The Great Gatsby. You have to be born into wealth, something you can't change. In 1984, scholar Dr. Abraham Thomas compared the racially segregated United States to the Indian caste system. Once divested of its exotic names, the caste system is nothing more or less than any system of social inequality involving changing patterns of domination, exploitation, and rebellion. I would submit the traditional race relations between blacks and whites in the US are strikingly similar, wherein state and national political structures in both countries are overwhelmingly controlled by the dominant group, the whites in the USA and the upper castes in India. Importantly though, and this is something that stories that want to use a caste system sometimes miss, caste systems bring with them a stronger philosophical or moral belief about why people should be divided the way they are, in a way that normal class systems don't usually. This is especially the case for any untouchable class. These are often based on historical events and relations between groups in society. So consider how your society may be a blend of a class and caste system, what philosophy may underpin the way things are structured and who is in each group, whether overt or subtle, and which historical events and relations those beliefs may be linked to. A list of choices and immutable characteristics contributing to social mobility and class may help define your system. So, you've got an idea on where the wealth, power, status come from in your society and how they interrelate. Let's build on that. Part 4. Class culture. Classes have cultures within themselves, how they talk, what they wear, what they eat, what they do for fun. Let's not be delusional here though. The most important factor is usually wealth. More wealthy classes will wear more expensive clothing, build more elaborate places, eat more and more expensive and more nutritional things, and do more expensive things, like build giant arenas for poor children to fight to the death in.
That is mahogany!
This has basically been true all throughout history right up to today. This is why the Irish peasantry relied on the less nutritious potatoes and abundant herring fish, while its upper class had access to cultivated vegetables and more expensive chicken. Silk was a mark of the imperial family in China for a time as a rare and beautiful resource. And in Harry Potter, the upper class has the luxury of killing muggle-born children in their spare time. So in devising internal class culture, figure out what food, material, and pastimes would be even financially available to each class in your world. Two big factors in this question are geography and trade. What can be grown and what materials can be harvested in their environment. The wet lowlands and climate of China meant that rice was a more viable resource than wheat. The cold weather of Ireland meant potatoes could be grown where other vegetables couldn't usually survive, and were thus expensive. But geography also necessarily becomes a lot less important with globalized or even interplanetary trade that lowers costs and diversifies the materials and food available to every class. Consider to what degree free trade impacts what food and material is available to each class. But even then, there are still usually class distinctions, even if only made for the point of status. In A Song of Ice and Fire, having a Valyrian steel sword, like the Tarly sword Heartsbane, is more a signifier of your class than anything else, despite it being unusually good metal. And in discussing this, there is an economic concept called a Veblen good, where demand increases as the price rises, largely due to them being status signifiers, like luxury cars or watches. But they also intersect with power signifiers. Why buy a $1,000 suit when a $100 suit serves the same function? The answer, Veblen said, was power. We mentioned silk as a sign of the imperial family in China, but this was actually legally regulated. Everyone else was forbidden to wear it. Status materials and foods often intersect with legal regulations, often in spite of them becoming cheaper due to trade as a way of maintaining those things as status symbols. They want to maintain their position, so they prevent others from having the things that signify that kind of position. Consider which things are indicators of each high, middle, and lower class status, which things are artificially scarce due to regulation to maintain their status, and which things are Veblen goods and materials that not only high status, but powerful individuals may acquire. But I think that the biggest misconception about class and status is that all of the classes in a society will have the same values and beliefs and practices and symbols. They don't. Not only do all of the different classes have kind of a microculture within themselves, their own distinct identity, but people within a class of a culture don't think the same or act the same or have the same practices, which is why when you have these stories that have a heavy emphasis on class culture or the struggle between classes, it can be a little bit stilted when all of the lower class people kind of act the same and think the same, and all the middle class people kind of act the same and think the same, and all the upper class people kind of act the same and think the same. When they just kind of don't. There isn't that sort of character unity. While classes do share cultural elements to an extent, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens makes a point that gloves are a mark of class in Victorian society. The finer the material, the higher you must be. Classes also culturally differ due to differences in occupation, power, religion, values, and economic pressures. Different political rights for Athenian women as a class led to the festival of Thesmophoria, which became increasingly associated with the lower classes by the last quarter of the 5th century. And men did not attend to this festival. It was a divide in cultural practices by class due to different pressures. Having a steel sword might be a status symbol in the warrior class, but not the craftsman class, if they're semi-equal. The religious divide between the poor that Christianity appealed to in the 1st and 2nd centuries and the Roman rich meant that lower classes valued selflessness in a way that the upper classes didn't, and that they believed different things to be morally valuable. Depending on how magic and technology is viewed by different classes, users will hold a different status in each class. Maybe magic users are used by the upper class to oppress the lower classes, so being born a magic user there means everyone kinda hates you. Figure out what values and practices the classes have in common, and then where they differ due to occupational, religious, and economic differences. This is where I think that a class structure will really come to shine. It's where it separates it from a very simple and kind of one-dimensional class structure that we see in some stories from one that has nuance, one that has depth. But also consider the differences in language. Different classes will have different vocabularies, they'll use different phrases, they'll speak with even different accents, especially if those classes are geographically distinct. If you want a linguistic gap, then come up with a few phrases or speech tropes to mark those differences, and represent those in your characters who come from different classes. And now, like a good oppressive caste system with me at the top, let us divide all of this into 7 classes. Firstly, though wealth, power, and status do correlate, they can still be distributed differently across the class system because they come from different places. Figure out what your society culturally values for status, materially values for wealth, and the type of political authority for who holds power. Secondly, though they correlate, the distribution of wealth, power, and status is often out of sync as society changes. Consider how societal understandings of these things that define class are changing at the time of your story, and which of these your class system is mostly based on. Thirdly, consider social mobility and how you acquire wealth, status, and power, especially in how the economy, culture, and politics are changing that may allow people to ascend or descend the class structure. Magic is often a shortcut available to all classes. Fourthly, consider what things make social mobility easier, like technology and levels of education, and which things make it harder, like social prejudices and legal barriers to entry. This is particularly prominent for untouchable classes. Fifthly, caste systems based on immutable characteristics make social mobility harder, but they don't necessarily have to be oppressive in fictional, alien, or non-human societies. Consider how your society might be a mix of class or caste systems, cultural and legal barriers for immutable or mutable characteristics. Sixthly, culture will differ from class to class. The most important determinant is usually wealth, but expansive trade improves the economic diversity of all classes. Consider what Veblen goods are in your society and which things are regulated for status reasons. Seventhly, the biggest misconception about class is that they all share the same values, practices, and status symbols. However, due to religious, occupational, and cultural divides between the classes, they will often see different things as marks of status, morality, and etiquette within their class that may not be the same in other classes. So, in a shocking twist of events, I may have underestimated how complicated class, wealth, and power is, and in my reading, I realized that I was going to need more than one video to discuss it. I was under the delusion that I could get it all done in half an hour. No. So there's another part coming to this where we're going to discuss how class and caste systems kind of start, which I hinted at in this video, and how they collapse, how they change, how they break, how they evolve. Only with a Marxist revolution, yeah, comrades! Sorry, the meme gets me every time. It'll be coming in a month or so. The glorious revolution. The video. The video will be coming in a month or so. Thank you to patrons, to the people who watch this, you're awesome. This was lots of fun. I'm really looking forward to the next few videos. In the meantime, stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.